Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our Oge East Book Club. This is the September edition. We have had 1 month off for summer. So welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be starting off with a book on Islam and evolution, inshallah. And the idea is we have the author who's actually going to deliver this month's session, and then we'll have around 45 minutes to him to talk about Islam and evolution, and then we will have around 45 minutes of questions and whatever you feel like you want to ask. So I'll give you a quick background for people who are joining us for the first time. Olgai's book club is, alhamdulillah, started in May 2019, so it's been several years now. So you're looking at around 6 years, alhamdulillah, and we've been going strong. So we've been delivering approximately monthly or bi-monthly sessions. So alhamdulillah, we've been doing this for 6 years, and we have like members from across the country, various professionals. Some people come and go, and it's all okay. And so different people, different age groups as well. And we have a number of authors within this group, alhamdulillah, and so they sometimes go through their books as well. So now, why did we set up Olgai's book club? So when we set up, we had like I think about 5 people who started the whole thing off, and the whole idea was to encourage reading, so reconnect with like this idea of books. We all say that we love books, and sometimes we need just that motivation of saying like, oh, I've read this amazing book, why don't you read it? And so we thought like, let's create something where we have a platform where people can come together and discuss it. And so we started this off around 6 years ago, and we called it Olga East Book Club because we started off in Olga East, and so that's primarily why we've got this name. And so the idea is to connect with people and read books together, review, share perspectives. So because we've got such a broad range of people with so many different backgrounds, each person brings their own kind of like interest and own perspective, and it's always interesting to hear other people's perspective as well. And then has this like spirit for us Muslims, especially when we realize that the whole idea of the very first command in the Quran is about reading, and the idea of reading to create like not just people who just follow dogma, but actually to start thinking about critically what they are reading and engaging with each other and on a societal level. And then obviously there's the other component that when you create a platform like this, then we bring a number of people from different backgrounds. And so this is an opportunity for us to socialize as well. So we have like group, social events and stuff like that, where we meet once every 3 months and so on. So going this year, especially this year, alhamdulillah, we've been doing one session every month, and it's open to everyone. We've got a Facebook channel on Facebook, and so we do record it, and then we give access to people to actually watch what we've done. So just to give some of the books that we've covered in the past, alhamdulillah, we've done a number of books, and you'll see that the range is quite broad. So we've done stuff on politics, Islam. We've had a brother who actually wrote a book through this process, so alhamdulillah, that was good. We've also had like Peter O'Born, who's come and he's delivered a book that he wrote, which was The Fate of Abraham, which was very good to actually get someone of his caliber to join our club. Now, tonight's event, alhamdulillah, we're going to have the author, who is Dr. Abu Mustafa, and he's going to be going through his book on Islam and Evolution and Islam Simplified. And this is his second book he's written. So we're going to look at Darwinian evolution, and which is like one of the things that, a lot of Muslims have lots of questions coming up, especially the young people who are going to universities, and it seems like it's in conflict with Islam. And so today, inshallah, we will give the session to the brother, and he will explain like Darwinian theory, what is it, what is the scientific basis of this, and does it have like, is it compatible with Islam, what does Islam say about the origin of life, where is the misconceptions, etc. And we will explore the actual science behind evolutionary theory and whether it is compatible. So just to give you a quick rundown of Dr. Abu Mustafa, he's a health sector professional. I believe he's a cardiologist, and he has got strong background in Islam and research and science. He holds a number of degrees and and higher research doctorate. He continues to learn under certain Islamic scholars, classical scholars, and he's authored several books. This is his second one. Inshallah, I will pass it over to Brother Abu Mustafa. And inshallah, at the end of 45 minutes, we will open it up for question and answers, which we will have a lovely discussion about the topic. Can I pass it over to Dr. Abu Mustafa, if you're there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. So I will stop sharing and I will hand it over to you.
Okay, super. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. جزاكم الله khairan, brother Abu Shama, for inviting me to come and speak about my new book. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the introduction. So my background is one of medicine. I'm a doctor. I'm a surgeon by profession in the NHS. I'm also a student of knowledge, and I started my journey as an author for two reasons. I never planned to be an author, to be honest, but I started it for two reasons. The first was that when I started as a student of knowledge, I started learning things that I was very surprised that I didn't know them before. The fundamentals of Islam, what I see as fundamentals of Islam today, having learnt a little bit about Islam, I didn't know these things when I was growing up, and I was very. I would describe myself as sort of, growing up as a moderate Muslim with just very bare basics. But there was a lot of questions I had, a lot of existential questions I had, which I couldn't quite find the answer to until I started studying Islam, and that happened for me in 2010 when I completed my surgical training, because the surgical training was very, very intense. So when I completed that, I had some time on my hands, and that, coupled with the fact that with having had children, when my children were starting to get a little bit older, when they were about 5, 6 years old, as parents, myself and my wife wanted to teach Islam to our children, and I found it actually wasn't very child friendly. The concepts were not child friendly. They're quite abstract, the concepts in Islam, and I didn't find them as a way of making them very easy for them to grasp. So, for example, what is worship is actually a very abstract concept for a child, and they don't really understand what worship is and how broad worship is. They view worship as being something like prayer, so salah, or reading Quran, reciting Quran. So I wanted to bring the fundamentals that I'd learned, and I wanted to try and simplify it. So my first book actually was this book here, which is Concepts of Islam Simplified, and I produced the first edition in 2020 in COVID times, which is the blue one, and then I produced a second edition in 2023. But one of the things I wanted to include in this book was some scientific topics, because there are questions that are being asked, and as brother Abu Shama correctly mentioned, evolution is causing a lot of consternation for Muslims and actually people of faith. And when I was growing up, evolution was actually not like it is today. So evolution was a subject in a part of science. It gave a description of how life evolved on the earth. And it was basically about mechanisms and how things happened, and that was pretty much it. So my Muslim identity had nothing to do with evolution. I was a Muslim, and I was learning science, and I was a man of science, and I enjoyed learning the mechanisms and how the world works. So for me, evolution was simply a mechanism that Allah was employing in the way He employs other natural laws in the world, on the earth, and in the universe. But evolution has itself evolved. So it has gone from being a subject, simple scientific matter, to being one where atheists have now propagated it and weaponized it to be a sort of a sword against theistic belief. And in particular, Richard Dawkins, who is himself a biologist, has used it to push for or in fact, to use it to push God out of the picture altogether. And he has famously said that Darwin made it possible for me to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So if Darwin's theory of evolution didn't exist, the atheist would have a difficult job of explaining why he how he believes the world has come about. It would be difficult for him to explain that, but Dawkins is putting forward that Darwin, by giving the theory of evolution, had actually made this a very intellectually viable option. And in fact, he pushes for the fact that it is not compatible with a God. So this I wanted to include in the first book, but the first book would have become way too big. It was already around 300 pages. It would have become around 600 pages and unmanageable. So I decided to split the book. And that led me to actually, first of all, go back and examine this topic. And I wanted to examine this topic in detail because it's a very polarized topic. Scientists will put forward now that evolution is scientific fact and there is no room for discussion. Just like, for example, that the earth is round or the earth is a sphere or the earth goes around the sun, they say that evolution is a scientific fact and they will not entertain people of faith trying to question things otherwise. And on the other side, you have religious scholars who are actually offended or they go even further than that. For example, in Muslim scholars, we have those who are offended by suggestion that evolution is actually a fact, because the culmination of evolutionary theory is that not only is life now explained from where it came about, but also man and the emergence of man, and man is the end product of evolution. So they are deeply upset by the fact that man is seen to be a consequent or a descendant of apes or primates or primate ancestor, to be more accurate. And some scholars have even gone so far to say that belief in evolutionary theory is tantamount to disbelief or kufr. So I wanted to understand this now, and I deliberately took a step back. I didn't know the details of the science. I didn't know the scientific evidences for evolutionary theory, and I didn't actually know the Islamic revelations and Islamic evidences for what Islam has to say on the origin of life or man. So I thought, okay, let's put the emotions aside and let's become impartial. Let's review these from a unemotional basis, from a rational basis. And I will look at the Islam, because we take, as Muslims, we take our Islam and revelation in particular, where it's unambiguous, we take that to be 100% certainty. I will look at that and what that has to say. And I will also look at the science of evolution for what it is, to see if it is actually scientific fact or not. And that is what culminated in my new book, which is Evolution in Islam Simplified, for young minds, teachers, and scientists. And this is not an academic book. I did not make it an academic book because my target audience is actually primarily teenagers and university students who want to understand this issue. And I have deliberately simplified it and given very key references, but not gone into lots of academia, even though I did the reading, because I wanted to be very friendly and easy to read. But the work that I did actually, I think, has been significant, that it's of value to, I think, teachers, for example, Islamic teachers or science teachers, and actually for scientists in this field as well. The book breaks down into 5 parts. I first start with basic principles. So I look at science for what it is, such as the scientific method. I look at then basic Islamic theological principles, which is Aqidah. From there, I move on to review neo-Darwinian theory, which I do from a scientific and a rational standpoint. And I see what the evidences are, and does the theory stack up? And then I move on to talk about the chemical origins of life, which is an area of research called abiogenesis. And this is a field to try and look at how did the chemicals in the early world, or the early Earth, come together to start creating life. So the timeline is basically that you have a Big Bang, and the origin of the universe is the Big Bang, which is 14 billion years ago, and then the Earth comes around 4.8 billion years ago, and then you have chemicals, and then water comes about on the Earth, and then the chemicals will come together and start to form cells and life. So there is a big step where inanimate chemicals such as water, carbon dioxide, methane, and other physical chemicals will actually come together and start forming the complex compounds that are found in cells, and then cells will form and then life will start. So that is a separate topic in itself. And then I go back in the fourth section to review basic principles such as what is randomness, what is design in nature, and I conclude by actually going into the Islamic revelations to see what does Islam have to say. And in fact, what ends up happening is that you have to split evolution of life into that of life in general and that of the evolution of man, which is not a split found in the scientific discipline. So these are the contents basically of the book. In basic principles, you can see that I talk firstly about scientific method, then I talk about probabilities, then I talk about what science can never answer, and then I move on to what I call lenses of Islam. These are basic Aqidah principles, but I've given 7 of them here, is what we should have in mind and what we should view the world through as Muslims. And then I move on to looking at the second part, evolution and neo-Darwinian theory, and the parts that I mentioned. So let's move on to evolutionary theory. So Charles Darwin is the man who is well known for this. There were already ideas about evolution existing before Charles Darwin, but Charles Darwin is the man who is credited with propagating this theory and putting it together. And in 1859, he wrote a book which was called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And it's a longer title than that, but that's what it's known by primarily. And he did this having traveled on a HMS Beagle, a ship which was traveling around the world. And when he came across various observations, for example, he came across these finches, birds that were on some islands of South America called the Galapagos Islands. And he noticed differences in their features, what we call traits. And for him, he noticed there were differences in the way the beaks were. The beaks could be long and pointy, or they could be short, or they could be short and stout. And he'd realized that actually these beaks seemed to correlate to the things they were eating. So those that finches, the birds that were eating on seeds, tended to have very strong, broad, stout beaks, which he called crushing bills. Their bills, their beaks, in other words, were very strong and stout. Whereas those that used to eat insects needed long and pointy ones so they could get into the crevices of between, in the wood between or in the bark, between the bark, or in the crevices between rocks. His theory was based, first of all, on noticing that farmers can breed animals and they can change the traits, or they can select out specific traits when they breed animals or plants, and intensify those traits. So they could make, for example, fruits sweeter, or they can change the color from a red color to a more orange color, those kind of things. He noticed that farmers were able to breed. And he thought that actually, it seems that in nature, if you have different environments, then the traits that that particular organism has will be selected by nature to be the ones that are better suited for that particular environment. So, for example, if you have a bird which is suited to seeds, but for example, there's a change in the environment and the seeds are disappearing, and now you are more reliant on insect eaters, actually, the insect eating finches with their longer beaks will actually be the ones that will do better. They will survive better. They will be able to reproduce and produce more offspring, whilst the ones with the stout beaks will struggle. And you will find that actually, if the environment was predominantly seeds, and this finch was predominant, actually, if the environment changes from seeds to insects, then this particular finch is more likely to become dominant and become the prevalent bird amongst the finch population. So his term natural selection basically was a way of distinguishing artificial selection, which is what farmers do, and the natural selection, the selecting was being done by nature. Darwin produced his theory before a lot of science was actually known to him. And as time went on, the disciplines of, for example, fossil studies, which is called paleontology, genetics, he had no knowledge of genetics, Darwin, but genetics was becoming an up and coming developing field. It became known that there are things called genes, Genes are housed in cells, and these are what influence traits in a particular organism. And then population theory, which is basically mathematical statistical application to look at organisms in a population and what makes them up and what influences them. So in the 1940s, they came together at a conference to bring all these disciplines together, and this was called the modern synthesis. And this is now called neo-Darwinian theory. So Darwin's theory is now practiced as neo-Darwinian theory. So what is neo-Darwinian theory? It has several strands. The first is that there was sequential progression of life over time. In other words, if you look at the fossil record and go back as far as you can, you will see certain organisms existed. And as you move forward and start coming towards modern time, those organisms disappear and are replaced by other organisms that are similar but different. And they have different traits. And as you move forwards in time, those organisms disappear and they're replaced by other organisms that are similar, but again have different traits. And this way, life is progressing so that you will see fossils that are changing over time to eventually you get the animals that you see today. The second aspect to this is that there was a common ancestor to all the life forms. So this is referred to as common descent. In other words, if you look at all the life forms today and you start winding the clock back, you will start to see that you start to get common ancestors to the life forms until you will end up with a single common ancestor at the top. And the very final common ancestor to all of this is the first single cell that existed on the Earth. So if we look at a timeline here, I mentioned already, we look at 14 billion years ago, there was the Big Bang. And then 4 years ago, around 4 billion years ago, water appears on the Earth. Then these are called prokaryotes. These are very, very basic cells. The next thing that happens is quite a long time down the line. It's almost around 2 billion years before eukaryotes form. Eukaryotes are a more advanced type of single cell. And then at 1.6 billion years is where the first multicellular organisms form. You've gone from a single cell that looks after all of its stuff and reproduces by itself, now to cells coming together to form an organism where you have different cells doing different. And then you're getting basic forms, for example, spines, and then corals. You go. There is the development of complex life forms like fish, like amphibians, tetrapods, these are four-legged animals, reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, and then the arrival of mammals. And then around 50,000 years ago is the arrival of what is thought to be Homo sapiens, which is the modern human. But the start of what are called hominids. Hominids are human-like fossils was around 5 million years ago. So human-like, so this is sort of like a bit ape-like and a bit human-like. These start about 5 million years ago. Now, a bit of basics about the cell, because I'm not sure what the level of knowledge here is amongst the audience about biology. So I'll cover a little bit of basic biology. The cell, if you remember back to basic days of biology, you might remember in the classroom, you might have stained some cells and looked at them under a light microscope. So here you have, the cell is a cytoplasm encloses the cell. That's basically the outer covering of the cell. And then inside you have this sort of pale area, which is the cytoplasm. And then you have the nucleus, which is the blob. And the nucleus is basically, so this is a depiction now. The nucleus is where the DNA is housed. The DNA is the complex molecule, which is made up of genes, and each gene codes for a protein. So each gene will code for a protein. So the DNA is basically a molecule, it's a macromolecule, so it's a massive structure, and its job is nothing other than information. It codes for information. It's a bit like if you are in a factory that produces food and cakes and stuff like that. It's a bit like the head office. The head office in the factory has got a binder on the shelf. It has all the recipes on there, and that's what the nucleus is like. It has all the information for producing the proteins in the cell. So the way it works is that the nucleus, the DNA will be copied. The gene that you need for producing the protein will be copied. That's called transcription. And in that copying, the DNA will result in a strand of a new molecule called RNA. And this strand is like taking the photocopy from the binder of the recipe book. It's the specific protein, sorry, it's a specific recipe that you want. So here, it's a specific protein and it will be processed, exported out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm. And then there, the protein is made out using the information from the RNA strand. And that process is called translation. So that this is basically like your photocopied recipe sheet. And now you use it to produce your cake. That's the protein. Proteins are made up of amino acids. Those are the building blocks. And the coding blocks in the DNA are called nucleotides or base pairs. Now, the reason I talk about that is because this next point is important to understand. You need to know that for this next point. So random variations in traits of organisms, for example, the beak length of the birds, is going to be due to the fact there is some random genetic mutation in the gene that codes for the length of the beak or the characteristic of the beak. So the mutation, so whenever the DNA cells divide, DNA has to be copied, and a copy has to be made, and then it's passed on to the daughter cells. And then when they divide, exact copies of the DNA is made again, and it's passed on to the daughter cells. That's how the system works. Now, if there's an error in the copying, that's called a mutation. And the mutation is what gives rise to the different variations that you see. Now, Darwin's theory is basically that variation will allow different success for the animal in terms of competing for resources in the environment. And those that are more successful, their traits will therefore persist and propagate and become prevalent in that population. This is called natural selection. So a good example of this is another thing that's used in evolutionary textbooks taught to school children is the story of the peppered moths. So the peppered moths were going back before the Industrial Revolution were very light colored. So they were sort of white with speckling on them. And then after the Industrial Revolution, which was sort of in the beginning of the 1800s, they become darker. So if you looked at a population of peppered moths before the Industrial Revolution, you would find that 95% of them were light colored. And then after the Industrial Revolution, 98% became dark. And the reason put forward was that the trees before the Industrial Revolution were light in color. They used to have lichen on them, and this lightness of the background meant that the light-colored moths were easier to survive, or rather better adapted to survive because they were camouflaged and therefore protected against predators. And after the Industrial Revolution, what happens is that the soot starts to coat the trees. The lichen on the tree bark starts to come off. And you get darker trees, and now the light-colored moth is standing out against the background, so it's more susceptible to being eaten by predators, whereas the dark one is now more camouflaged. You can barely see it here. Okay, so we've summarized neo-Darwinian theory. These are the 5 strings to it, or 5 strands to it. Now, so what you get is when you look at evolutionary theory and the study of evolution, you see these beautiful diagrams or lineages where you see, this is going back to this is 415 million years ago. You see a particular type of fish, and then you see how it's changing over time. And as time goes on, they've got different characteristics. And you can see that the fins are getting longer until you reach this one here. This is called Tiktaalik. This one is the first one they've established that has got fins which could actually bear the weight of the animal. So this is a sort of a key one in the lineage. And as you go on, you can see the fins are becoming more like legs, and then finally you have legs, and you now have amphibians here. And this is where it goes on to become tetrapods, and this goes on to give rise to the line of mammals. Similarly, you have another lineage here. This one is looking at land animals and how this particular land animal over time started to return to water, and these legs have gone in reverse now. They're starting to disappear and form fins. And eventually, as you move downwards, you see that you have the arrival of whales. So whales and dolphins. These are mammals that are living in water. So they are actually, their ancestry is supposed to be land animals that return to the water. And again, this is another one depicting dinosaurs. So dinosaurs are the ancestors to birds. So along the line here, you get to this one here, where the birds, dinosaurs started to actually acquire feathers. And then you have this one is a sort of a dinosaur with feathers. And then it goes on to give, you have a lineage of birds from there. All of this looks really nice. And evolution, if you just look at it like that, it looks great. I mean, I never had any problem with this. But when I started looking into the theory and getting into the evidences of it, I was actually more and more shocked to find there were gaping holes in the theory. And this, I have actually presented in the book 14 things that flaws in the theory of neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. And I'm just going to present a couple of things because I can't possibly cover them in the time. So the first thing I want to show you is the ear. This is the ear, human ear, and you have the pinna, you have the ear hole. This is where you stick your Q-tip when you want to take your earwax out. And further down, you have the eardrum. This is what you mustn't hit with your Q-tip. And the eardrum connects to a series of 3 bones. This is called the malleus, incus, and stapes. This is the lever system of tiny, tiny bones. And then these bones connect onto a membrane. And that membrane is this sort of fluid-filled area here. And as the sound waves come through the ear, they reverberate on the eardrum. This causes oscillations. The lever system will oscillate and amplify this. And then they will be reproduced into the fluid-filled canal system here. And there are specialized cells. There are specialized cells in there which look like this. They're called stereocilia, cochlea cells, sorry, and they have little projections on them called stereocilia. So as this fluid, this is the fluid, this is depiction of the fluid, as the fluid moves, the fluid is moving because of the oscillations made by the sound wave. The stereocilia move on this cell. So it's basically like, kind of like tentacles, and then the fluid moves the tentacles, and each movement of the tentacle produces a nerve impulse from the cell base, which goes into the nerve here. And this is the nerve that will go to the brain and produce the sound. The nerve impulse will go to the brain and be interpreted as a sound impulse. Now, the stereocilia are unbelievably sensitive. They are very complex in their design. They are very sensitive. They are so sensitive that if the stereocilia actually even moves 1 atom's breadth, it will produce a nerve electrical impulse. That's how sensitive they are. So now just note that this is the bone. This yellowy orangey thing is the bone. So this middle ear and the inner ear, what's called the inner ear, are housed inside the bone. So this is what the evolution of the middle ear has been shown as. We have a jaw. We all have a jaw. The lower jaw is called the mandible in humans and in mammals. But the jaw, if you go back in time, was made up of multiple bones. So the mandible we have is 1 single long bone. But if you go back in time, the jaw used to be made up of multiple bones, and they used to be called things like the quadrate, the articular, the angular. And the colors here show you, in fact, this picture shows you, the different colors show you the different bones that used to fuse together to make up the lower jaw. Now, over time, what happens is that one of these bones actually becomes longer and longer and longer until in the mammal, there is only 1 jaw bone here called the mandible. But before this, it was made up of multiple bones. And in the evolution of the ear, what you see is that the back bit of these bones used to be part of the jawbone. And then over time, what's happened is they start separating and becoming smaller till eventually here at this point, they're not actually part of the jaw. They're not actually part of the joint at all. And they become separate in terms of they have no relation to the jaw joint. And finally, when they come to the mammals, these bones have actually, these tiny little bones here have separated out from the jaw altogether. So this is the evolution of the ear and the evolution of the jaw. Now, the problem is, if you just look at the animals that depict this, this is a sort of looks a bit like a dinosaur, but it's not. And you see that as these jaw formation is changing, you can see the animals that they have found in the fossils to represent these until you hit mammals, which is down here. Now, the problem is, the first problem here is, why did these little bones move away and separate from the jawbone? So what they postulate in evolutionary theory is that the jaw, in order to make a stronger bite, the jaw bones were multiple bones. They had to become one long bone in order to achieve a stronger bite. And that's why the other bones were pushed away. And then alongside that, they say, this is one author describing the evolution of bones. For the first time in the history of the known vertebrate fossil record, Morganucodon shows an exclusive function of these posterior jaw bones in hearing, not in supporting the jaw. The nerve of hearing would pick up the subtle movements of the stapes. Stapes is the inner bone of that three bones I showed you, as it displays the inner ear fluid via the oval window and convert this fluid-borne energy into impulses that could be interpreted by the brain. Okay, so there's actually a number of problems here with what he's saying. The first is, why did these jaw bones, multiple bones, become one bone? So they postulate that this is because the jawbone had to become stronger. In order to become a stronger bite, the jaw bones had to fuse. Well, the strongest bite in the animal kingdom is by the Nile crocodile, which generates 5,000 psi. Psi is precious per square inch. It's by far the strongest bite achieved in the animal kingdom, in fact, in any kingdom. And the crocodile has a bone structure like this. It has multiple bones making up its jaw, not a single bone like this. It's multiple bones. It's like the ancient or prehistoric bone structure. So to say that the bone structure had to change because animals had to develop a stronger bite doesn't hold water, because the strongest bite of all is the crocodile, which still has the same structure as this. So that doesn't make any sense. The second thing is, why would these little bones actually separate and come off from the jaw? And how do they start connecting with the hearing? So he said here, he goes that the exclusive function of these posterior jaw bones was in hearing, not in supporting the jaw. Okay, why is it supporting the hearing now? It's come off from the jaw. We don't know why. That's not been explained, but why is it supporting the hearing? Then he makes the statement the nerve of hearing would pick up subtle movements of the stapes. But the nerve of hearing, that's not how nerves work. Nerves work, if you can have a nerve running through this area, but the nerve has got nothing to do with sound. You can have a sound as loud as you like. Just because the nerve is nearby, it doesn't produce sound in a nerve. In order to make the nerve is basically like an electrical wire. You can't produce sound, cannot produce electrical impulses in a wire unless you have a microphone to convert the sound into electrical impulses, which then go down the electrical wire. So the nerve of hearing, why is there a nerve of hearing? Because it's got no role. There is no hearing at this point for the animal. How does that nerve detect generate the electrical impulses? Because sound itself won't do it, and neither would these bones. There needs to be an electrical transduction system which will convert the sound wave into electrical impulses, and that is the cochlea and the stereo cells, the stereocilia on these cells. That's what actually does that. It's not just a nerve passing by the area. Then it talks about the oval window. So let's go back to this picture. The oval window is a defect in the bone over here. So why would the bone develop a hole here, and why would a membrane stretch across it? That's what the oval window is. Why would there be a membrane stretching across it? Then bone is got inside bone, you find bone marrow. You don't find fluid-filled areas or canals filled with fluid. So why has this structure formed, which is the cochlea? Where's that come from? Because that makes no sense either. And then where did these cells come from that make up the sensing system for sound? The stereocilia with the cells, the hair cells, what are called hair cells, where did these come from? How did these form? And where did these nerve connections form so that they can transmit the impulse? So this is something that I found repeatedly when I analyzed their evidence is that they brush huge areas under the carpet and you just don't have an explanation. So if we go back to what he said here, he says these posterior jaw bones are showing an exclusive role in hearing. Okay, why? The nerve of hearing, where did that come from? Would pick up subtle movements of the stapes? No, it wouldn't. You need a system connected to the sound waves that will convert the sound waves into electrical impulses. So that is brushed completely aside where that's come from. Displace the inner fluid of the ear. Okay, where did the inner ear fluid come from? Because it didn't come from bone. That's not what bone does. It produces bone marrow via the oval window. Where did the oval window come from? What's the reason to produce a defect in the bone? Then it converted this energy into impulses. All of that has been brushed away for them to produce this sort of wishy-washy statement that they've explained how the middle ear has formed and how sound has evolved and hearing has, sorry, not sound, how hearing has evolved in animals. So this was a serious concern for me that this is not an adequate explanation at all. Then when you go back and start looking at these beautiful lineages that they have to start wondering, well, actually, what was the benefits the animal was gaining in going from one animal to the next animal? So in other words, just to come back to this point here, remember that Darwinian theory says there has to be a survival benefit. There has to be a very, very small change. And it has to be, that change in the animal has to produce a survival benefit. So all of these things we just talked about, the nerve of hearing, the defect in the bone to make the oval window, the inner ear cells, the hair cells, the stereocilia, the movement of these little bones away from the jaw to separate from there and make a completely separate system. What was the benefit, survival benefit to the animal to explain that it survived in the animal, that this trait was surviving in the animal? Where's the benefit for all of these things? There's no explanation at all. And simultaneously, so that you have produced a complicated sound system of hearing. So again, now when you go back to look at these lineages, you have to start wondering, what is the reason that you're getting changes in these fins? What's the survival benefit from this animal to this animal to this animal to this animal? They've given you the changes here that you see between them. Like, for example, you start to see a single large limb bone articulated with two smaller bones. Why? What's the survival benefit there? Here you have weight-bearing elbows, bending wrists. That was the tiktaalik. Why? Where's the survival benefit in that? So all of these lineages, they show they're beautiful lineages, but where are the survival benefits? And that's what I was left with after I was looking at these. Where are the survival benefits? There's a big fat gaping hole here. Okay. I'll move on to, I think, in the view of time, I'm going to skip.
Assalamu alaikum, sorry, just to pause you there. We are around 40 minutes mark.
Yeah.
So we scheduled 45. If you you can have an extra 10 minutes if you would like.
Yeah, extra 10 minutes, and I'll try to move along now.
Okay.
With the
So
next one. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to leave altruism, and I'm going to move on to extreme complexity. So I need to show you a short video briefly in order to demonstrate this. So I'm very quickly just going to show a couple of key steps here. This is a human cell. This is what a human cell looks like in reality. It's not a little blob that we saw earlier on the light microscope. When you actually look under very much higher magnification and detail, it's very, very, very complicated. I just want to show you. Okay. So this purple strand is the DNA, and this conglomeration of blue things and green things, these are all complex molecules and enzymes to produce the RNA I talked about earlier, that process called gene transcription. So what you're seeing here is the DNA here,